So nearly 50 years ago, it'll be 50 years in 2020, the first Earth Day in 1970 mobilized 20 million Americans who took to the streets, to parks, to college campuses to demonstrate for a healthy, sustainable environment, and they had massive coast-to-coast rallies. That first Earth Day is credited with really sparking the modern environmental movement and the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, as well as the landmark laws such as the Endangered Species Act. Well, with us today is the person who was behind that, Denis Hayes, the national coordinator of that very first Earth Day and the founder of Earth Day Network. Since that first Earth Day, Denis has served as head of the nation's Solar Energy Research Institute during the Carter administration. He's worked in think tanks. He's taught engineering at Stanford University, written books, taught law, and is now president of the Bullitt Foundation, where he oversaw the creation of the Bullitt Center, which is the most sustainable building in the world. Denis is the board chair emeritus of Earth Day Network, and I want you to join me now in welcoming one of the world's most important environmental leaders, Denis Hayes.
That's one of those introductions that everyone fears, Kathleen. Anything that comes has to be a letdown, but thank you very much for those kind remarks. It's my great pleasure tonight to introduce the winner of the Earth Day Network 2016 Climate Visionary Award, Mindy Lewbert. Mindy was one of our best organizers for the very first Earth Day, or to be more precise, one of our best organizers at Long Beach High School. I have to confess, I'm thrilled these days to even find anyone who was alive for the first Earth Day, but Mindy was a high schooler. Because of the power of this program, I'm going to talk a little bit about some things that are unknown about the first Earth Day. There are lots of things that are unknown, including that by far our largest source of financial support was the United Auto Workers, which comes as a shock to most people, considering that our first triumph was the Clean Air Act, with kind of important consequences for their industry. But they had a president of the union who came and said, you know, these guys know how to design clean cars, and my guys can build anything that they can design, and by God, let's go do it. And it was a wonderful sentiment. But more to the point for tonight was the role of women. There's a myth that the first Earth Day was largely organized by students, and that's because that was how it started. Senator Nelson had the idea of having campus teach-ins at universities across the country, because we had teach-ins on the war, we had teach-ins on civil rights. Maybe we could have some teach-ins on conservation, so he called it an environmental teach-in. He and Pete McCloskey recruited me to come down and pull together a team of just hotshot student organizers, pulled from the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, the Chicano movement. We sent them out to campuses across the country, and there was close to zero interest. I mean, this was the A team, and they couldn't stir up a rally to do anything. And so suddenly we found ourselves with something that was relatively high profile, relatively, at that point, funded, superb organizers, and they weren't getting any place. So we started analyzing the mail that had come in from the press that went out. And it was a wonderful time in terms of the press, because people would write articles. We went out and specifically solicited magazine after magazine that appealed to a particular group that we tried to bring into it. And 9 times out of 10, at the end, the article, they'd put our telephone number, our street address, and whoever wanted to would contact us. This is how you did it before the internet. So we looked at them, and overwhelmingly, they were women. And the nature of this then changed. We moved it off of college campuses. A fair number of them were K-12 teachers, so there was a really big K-12 thing. We went into the National Education Association, which supported us and helped get it into the formal process by which they communicated with all of their members, and the National Science Teachers Association as well. But a huge number of them were women. In single wage earner families, typically with college educations, typically with 1 or 2 young kids who hadn't really been involved in anything before, either because it was controversial or it might imperil their husband's job, or they just, for whatever reason, had not done anything. And this issue moved something in them. And some of them just turned into the most kick-ass organizers you can imagine, working with high-powered people in big cities, New York, Chicago, San Francisco. For decades after the first Earth Day, every time that I encountered a woman who was a state legislator, a member of Congress, a public utility commissioner, a member of a city council, and admittedly there's a selectivity, it's the ones that I met, I don't pretend that this is for the country, but every one of them said the first political thing they had ever done in their life was Earth Day. There's something about the array of women who have been here tonight being honored and talking and who've done such extraordinary things, because it's a little bit embarrassing to my gender. Your gender resonates with this issue in a very, very special way. And I'm delighted after all of these decades that finally we're seeing across the board women moving into positions of power and authority, women who are no longer sort of out there in the shadows doing all of the work, but coming out and actually seizing the reins of leadership and improving things. In the immediate aftermath of that first Earth Day, and I realize that most of you have had at least one glass of wine and it's the end of the night and you're not here for me to talk about Earth Day, but for a variety of very complex reasons having to do with, interestingly, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the flip of the solidly Democratic South to Nixon, the flip of a whole bunch of progressive Republicans, and a sketchy kind of relationship to the party, that we had one of the more anti-environmental presidents in American history of his own volition decide, at least according to John Ehrlichman, the afternoon of Earth Day to set up an Environmental Protection Administration. In the immediate aftermath, we had the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, Rodenticide Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, Corporate Average Fuel Economy Standards, Hazardous Materials Transportation Act, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, Toxic Substances Control Act, and about a dozen others that are sort of less well known that all took place in the first 4 years after Earth Day. The net benefits, you figure out there are costs to this stuff, there are benefits to it. The net benefit, I think, of that period of time over the course of the years since almost certainly totals more than $100 trillion. In a fairly thorough analysis of the Clean Air Act of 1970, that one piece of legislation, mostly in public health benefits, is thought to have contributed a net of $23 trillion to America's well-being. The only parallel in the history of American economic reform, I think, was the New Deal, and that was led by a hugely popular president emerging from the Great Depression. The environmental revolution, from the local watershed to the halls of Congress, was propelled by largely anonymous women who cared passionately, who did their homework, and who just refused to give up. The time, as you will all know if I were to give a standard environmentalist talk here tonight, is long overdue for a new burst of energy, a new burst of enthusiasm, a new burst of commitment to address the absolutely staggering global challenges that we face. Our toughest problems, from climate change to endangered migratory species to ocean pollution and overfishing and on, cannot be solved by any one nation. It can only take a global resolution. And the time is overdue as well to address the special requirements of the poor in this country and the destitute of the world. As wars have repeatedly shown for millennia, there is no lasting peace without justice. And similarly, the climate wars and the emerging water wars are showing, and Flint, Michigan has reminded us that there can be no lasting sustainability either without justice. So Earth Day 2020, the entire month of April 2020, powered by a pervasive global internet, offers an opportunity for all of these strands to be tied together into a recognition that we are one planet, that we're one people. So I'm counting on all of you and your families and your friends and your employers, your churches, your civic groups, to make April 2020 a genuine inflection point in human history, a date that people will look back on 50 years after that, the way that they look back upon that first Earth Day in 1970 now. A huge part of what that will be dealing with is climate, and that finally brings me back to Mindy Lewbert. Mindy first crossed my path when I recruited her from MassPerg to be on the board of directors of an Earth Day type affair called Sunday back in 1978. The Sunday was a one-time public explosion. It did not go on year after year as Earth Day did. It's now been largely forgotten. But Rosalind Carter was our honorary chair, and she dragged her husband along to the events and helped persuade him to put some solar collectors on the White House. Robert Redford was our New York host. Every science teacher in the United States got engaged in things in their classrooms, and we had about 10 million people who participated in a variety of rallies. Along with key congressional champions, most notably Senator Tim Wirth. Tim, would you stand up? Wherever you are. Senator Tim Wirth, then of Colorado, who was not just a reliable vote, but a reliable leader, a person who consistently took the initiative on things, and a handful of his colleagues, under pressure from Mindy Lewbert, really transformed, for a period, this nation. Mindy played just a central role in channeling what was public enthusiasm into several years of smart policy when America led the world on all renewable energy technology. We've sort of forgotten that as well, that there was this period, the golden years, as those of us who were involved of it think of it, when we were adequately funded, when this nation was producing more PhDs, spending more money, getting more patents than the rest of the world combined. And when that fell off the cliff, the then Secretary of Energy, a former dentist, told me that he was basically shutting down the Institute, reducing our budget by about 80%, reducing my staff by 50%, reducing our outside contractors at places like Caltech and MIT and Stanford, two of whom went on to win Nobel Prizes. He was reducing them by 100%, cutting off everything with no notice and no severance pay. The explanation was that solar didn't have a future. He could prove scientifically, definitely, that solar photovoltaics could never get to be less than 25 to 30 cents a kilowatt hour. Those of you who follow this stuff may have noticed that last week, Dubai's most recent purchase was for a guarantee of 2.99 cents per kilowatt hour, and those are in 2016 dollars, not in 1980 dollars. We left that guy so far in the... But that's using Chinese modules that got the prices down that far because of German policy. We could have gotten there vastly faster if we had stayed on course, on the course that Mindy was leading us into. There was solar, wind, hyper-efficiency. That was her portfolio in 1978. In other words, Mindy Lewbert was fighting for climate solutions before we even knew for sure that we had a climate problem. After getting an MBA as well as her law degree, Mindy went on to have just an awesome career. She was the regional administrator of the EPA under the Clinton administration. In addition to the Massachusetts Public Interest Research Group, she led a variety of NGO activities throughout New England. She was the founder and the president of Green Century family of mutual funds. And most important for tonight's award, she became one of the best known and most powerful leaders in triple bottom line investing, a perch from which she has brought relentless pressure on companies to prepare for life in a climate-constrained world. Mindy is the longtime president of Ceres, which presumably needs no introduction to anybody that is in the audience here tonight. It interestingly needs no introduction to anyone who is a CEO of a Fortune 500 company. When she comes up and takes the microphone, you will be shocked to learn that Mindy is remarkably nice. She's deceptively gentle. She is smart as a whip, deeply committed, fearless, relentless, and almost invariably successful. As part of her work at Ceres, Mindy directs the Investor Network on Climate Risk, which is an alliance of 120 institutional investors with collective assets of $14 trillion. INCR's whole purpose is to coordinate investor initiatives to address the financial risks and opportunities that are brought by climate change. By marshaling evidence about the investment implications of stranded assets for electric utilities, about the proper valuation of the mineral resources that companies have on their balance sheets that can never be mined or drilled, about the implications of a price on carbon for various sectors of the global economy, Mindy has changed the way that institutions view investments. Mindless diversification of the sort that was just commonplace 5 years ago, candidly is still way too commonplace today, is now at the enlightened places a thing of the past. For fundamental, unassailable reasons, Mindy knew that Peabody Coal was going to go bankrupt years before it went bankrupt. And those of us who listened a few years ago and divested didn't lose a penny as that industry sank into the toilet. Some of you will recall, those of you of a certain age will recall, a famous advertising campaign that was built around the premise that when E.F. Hutton speaks, everyone listens. With $14 trillion in investment assets behind her, with scores of successful campaigns behind her, when Mindy Lewbert speaks, business listens. So ladies and gentlemen, the very well-deserved 2016 Climate Visionary Award, now to Mindy Lewbert.
I'm not going to take it in here.
All right.
No.
I'm not touching it.
Well, maybe we can set it down over here.
Set it down right there. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you all. And thank you to Dennis. I want to say one thing. When I was asked who I would like to introduce me, and that was nice, I had two people in mind. And Dennis, I have to be honest, you weren't the first. The first one, was my 21-year-old daughter, Jessie, who is tied up in exams, but the reason we're all here is about my Jessie and your children, and we'll come back to it. Once I knew my daughter couldn't do it, there was no other person more obvious than Denis Hayes, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that for a minute. But first, congratulations, Kathleen, and to the Earth Day movement you've built. It is about leadership. It is about bringing people in to this movement who aren't like all of us. It is about thinking about climate change and who it impacts and how it impacts people from an environmental justice perspective. You have built an organization and an operation that is about values, that is about caring, that is about leadership, and my hat goes out to you. You've done an extraordinary job. And to Rachel, to be up here with Rachel, who best to be honoring and who better a partner than for me to stand side by side with. So congratulations to you. I want to talk for 1 minute about Denis Hayes, who really was the right person despite my allegiance to Jessie, my little one. Denis not only started Earth Day, but Denis was one of the founding directors of Ceres. And I would say when the Exxon Valdez oil spill happened, and a few people came together and said, this is not right. And this was done because people were irresponsible, were not thinking through the implications of it. It was Denis Hayes and Joan Bavaria, two thought leaders, visionaries, who started an organization called Ceres about integrating sustainability into capital markets, making sure that it was not environment versus corporations, but that sustainability, which wasn't a word then, we had some other words, but sustainability mattered, and that companies need to be either held to account or to be part of the solution. And they built a model, which I think is an extraordinary model, which is why I joined after my years as a regulator in the Clinton administration, that was about working with businesses and investors and using the power of investors to change businesses when they didn't want to change. When somebody calls the CEO of one of the largest Fortune 500 companies and says, I'm the chair of Ceres, and I also happen to be the CEO of CalPERS, my present chair, and we think you are not managing your sustainability risks right or well, and it's going to make you a non-profitable corporation over the long term. It was that model, that theory of change, that money matters, power matters. The largest financial institutions in the world and the largest companies, if brought into being on the side of building a sustainable economy, of using their resources, of making sure their people are paid well, of supporting the right policies, that we actually might win. And that's the model that gives me optimism for why I think we might win nevertheless. So Denis, for your vision of starting Ceres in 26 years ago, it was not only Earth Day, but it was very much, so much of what I think is driving change in this day and age. Let me quickly, understanding full well that you all want to go home, and that's understandable, let me talk about things, and this 5 following words or concepts are going to come up throughout my very quick talk. One is speed, one is scale, one is Abe and Jesse, my children, and the other is optimism. And you will hear those 5 words throughout, and then we'll send you off to go have a healthy evening. Earth Day is important for lots of reasons, but I had the absolute privilege and the luxury of being at the United Nations on Earth Day this year, for the signing of the Paris Agreement. It was on Earth Day that we stood there. 175 world leaders from everywhere on this globe who were part of coming up with the most ambitious, the most audacious, a magnificent 35 pages that truly has the ability to change the world. It hasn't yet changed the world, but it is our blueprint for action. Nobody would have expected in a million years to have 175 nations say we need to be a fossil fuel-free nation by 2050. To get to a 2-degree world, although throughout the document it talks about getting to a 1.5-degree world, which I would guess everybody in the room believes needs to be the case, we need to do a lot of things. But to have that agreement, something none of us expected, I don't think until the final pen went down and the final gavel, that we would have a document that says the world wants to go to a fossil fuel nation. 175 countries will support it. We have a blueprint that says 2% or lower, and we now need to get on board in making that happen. Friends, we have an extraordinary document. But now it is up to every single one of us to make that document real. There is nothing that says we will meet those goals if we don't double down. I think we can. I'm optimistic, and I will tell you why. But it is about scale and scope. We will not get to a fossil fuel-free world by 2050 at the pace we're going. We are moving. Today is different than 5 years ago, and today is very different than 10 years ago. Companies that made no commitment are saying we'll reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 50% and not 20%, or we'll invest in renewables to power our facilities 100% of our energy use. So things are changing, and despite that, we need to go faster. I want to talk about a few examples, but first I want to talk about what I think we all need to do when we walk out of here, and something that somehow has to happen. And do not think I'm being unrealistic or naive. Maybe I am being unrealistic or naive. But climate change and addressing it is about our future. It is about whether we deliver to our children a crippled planet where we are struggling for water, where we are making food that's not really food, where we're dealing with a planet that is irreparably harmed, or we could deliver them a planet that works. Somehow this issue, and again, this is where you may say, we're in Washington, why are you so naive? It's all about politics. I want to argue, and I want all of us to argue, that climate change is not and cannot be a political issue. This is not about blue states versus red states. It is not about conservatives versus liberals. It is not about my home of Brookline, Massachusetts, and Berkeley, California, versus Des Moines, Iowa. This is about our children's future. And whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, whether you're a capitalist or environmentalist, whether you're from a blue state or a red state, any one of us would jump in front of a bus barreling at our children. We would do so without hesitation and without thinking. That bus is coming. It is coming fast. And we've got to. And yes, I know we're in Washington, and yes, I've been in and out of politics. I'm not Pollyanna. But we have got to change this debate and move it from a political issue to an issue of our families, our future, to Abe and Jesse and all they stand for, your children. My children, I used to drag them around when I was EPA administrator, and I think they were like 8 and 3 or 8 and 4. Now they're 25 and 21. But it doesn't much matter. There is nobody. There is not a person in this room or a person I run into in corporate boardrooms or in political rallies who are not about their families, their children, and building for the future. And we have got to change this debate from a political one to a family one. You know, thank you. I want to quickly talk about some of my reason for optimism. At Ceres, we're about integrating sustainability into capital markets. We work with 95 multinational companies, and as Denis said, 120 major investors. Many of these are people who 10 years ago didn't think about climate change, thought it was an environmental Birkenstock sandal issue, something that other people cared about. But why were you coming to talk to me? I was asked by many CEOs and other executives about climate change. Well, of course we were going to talk to them because climate change is as much the greatest economic issue facing us as it is a national security, environmental, public health, and future of our kids. But the world has changed. We are no longer debating whether climate change is a fundamental economic issue. Tell me a company that can survive without enough water to run its facilities. Go talk to the people in farming and agriculture in California just having dealt with the drought. Go talk to Levi's, Strauss, and the Gap when they saw their cotton crop die in Texas due to the drought. We could tell story after story after story. Climate is about the economy as well as everything else. And what I am seeing is that companies are understanding it. They are understanding it and they are starting to change. Fast enough, no. At the scale we need, not yet. But it is radically different than it was 5 years ago. Whether it's PepsiCo's Performance with Purpose, where every single person in the company has to have a climate goal, a water goal, a waste goal, whether it's Citigroup who's here, who said they are going to put $100 billion, not million, but $100 billion into a clean energy future, or the institutional investors we're working with, who are starting slowly to get out of fossil fuels and into renewables. This year we saw $360 billion put into renewable and clean energy. We need $1 trillion a year by 2030 to meet the needs of energy. I believe we could get there. If we are at $360 billion this year, we can be at $500 billion in 2020, and we can be at $1 trillion a year. There's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of money to be moved. We've got to match that money, the money that comes into the needs that Rachel talked about. It is not all about the developed world. It is about the developing world and people who will be hit the hardest and the swiftest as climate change grows. But the changes are clear, whether it's Tim Cook of Apple standing up and saying 100% of our energy will be renewable, whether it's the dozens of companies saying we are going to get to 50% of our fleet to be clean energy vehicles over the next 5 years. Just get the stuff out on the product line. Those things are happening and they're starting to change. But I do want to say, it will not happen. We will not and cannot meet what Paris demands that we must meet without policy changes. Given the pace, given the scale, given the speed we need to go at, we need to make sure that not only are 500 companies or 110 investors doing what's right or starting to move, we need to make sure that 100,000 companies are doing just that, and they're not yet there. At Ceres, we are bringing the voice of businesses, investors into the debate. They cannot any longer just change what they can change in their own facilities. And they cannot stand by while the Chamber of Commerce says, we know you care about climate change in your plants, but we're going to oppose climate change legislation. I think the world's ready. I know what's going on politically, but we need to get ready. We have 1,200 companies supporting the Clean Power Plan. They will support a price on carbon. We're meeting with every one of them now. We have 450 investors who either came with us or supported the Paris Agreement, but were out in force in Paris. It is those hundreds of capital market leaders that are ready to add their voice to the Earth Day Network voice, and to the religious community, and to the environmental community, and to the Hispanic community, and every community that has been out saying we need to move policy, because we can't get there with one-offs. We have got to get there through a clean power plan in the United States, through a price of carbon here and all around the world. We need to make Paris a reality. I am bullish, I am optimistic that we can, we are getting there, but we need policy change, and every one of us needs to bring our neighbors, our priests, our rabbis. For us at Ceres, it's hundreds, if not thousands, of companies and the executives at the highest level to stand up and say, no, we're not rolling back the fuel economy standards, which some people think we're about to do. That will not happen. I talked to General Motors yesterday, and they said they will stand by the fuel economy standards that doubled the needs of companies. We need to make sure that everybody is standing for those kinds of changes. It is about making sure the Paris Agreement comes to fruition. If the United States can't deliver, think about what other countries will do. I believe we can deliver. I believe we could do so at the pace, at the scale, in a way that Abe and Jesse deserve to have a future, and Abe and Jesse as proxies for your family, your children, your nieces and nephews. I'm optimistic, but we have got to change this debate. Let's all go out and do it. I know we'll get there. I look forward to working with each and every one of you. Thank you for this honor.